rule of law that existed in Cuba. Obviously, that has been wiped out, for the most part, across the board, and it will require the nurturing and re-implementation of democratic institutions, something that will not be easy at all, and it will take a lot of time and a lot of hard work, but I believe that it's doable. As a lawyer, my bias obviously is the first and central important tenet of the rule of law is an independent judiciary. Right now you have a judicial branch that's completely subject to the whims of the military regime. It has no independent quality about it. I don't have time to go through examples, but I think most of you are familiar with those. Despite the bias of being a lawyer, people who have studied these transitions know that, for example, in Eastern Europe, and we'll get to that in a little bit, the reason things worked fairly well was because there was an administrative resolution of many disputes, including property disputes. If we don't have the luxury in Cuba to spend years litigating in the soon-to-exist independent Cuban courts, which don't exist today, there has to be a claims period and a mechanism where important decisions can be made administratively if the country's going to move forward in a realistic time frame. Alternative dispute resolution, arbitration, mediation will be obviously crucial in this regard. Obviously, none of that exists currently in Cuba. There's no independent bar association. Oh, okay, is that my pointer?
Yes.
Oh, wow, okay. Oh my God, I can be dangerous now.
You can also you also have control on your slides.
Okay. Okay. So, all right. The Declaration of Universal Human Rights in 1947 served as the basis of the foundation of the United Nations. To me, all human rights are equal. The freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech are not more important nor less important than, for example, the right of private property. To me, it's a seamless web, and that has to be the way that Cuba gets back on track with the rule of law. The expansion of civil society, which has been occurring over the last several years, has to obviously accelerate. The engineers here tonight will very adequately talk about the co-relationship of infrastructure development with economic reconstruction. Next slide. Okay, there we go. Cuba had the 1940 Constitution, which was a very advanced constitution for its time. In some aspects, it was more left of center than the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, it never really had a chance to provide a sustained framework for political development in Cuba because of the military coup in 1952 and then the revolution in 1959. Castro sort of arbitrarily replaced it with La Ley Fundamental, which incorporated some of its provisions, but only while it suited him. For example, the prohibition against capital punishment was eliminated when he saw fit. The extensive protections of private property, stronger than those in the U.S. Constitution, were eliminated when he saw fit, etc. Cuba still always has had a civil law system, different than our English common law. It's based on, obviously, the Napoleonic Code, the Spanish Civil Code, which still exists in Cuba, at least in theory or at a low level, and will obviously be the way that Cuba will develop in the future. The property registries and notarial protocols, which documented property transfers, are still largely intact in Cuba. Now, that might change between now and the time that there's a transition, but for now, they still exist, and I'll talk more about that later. Unlike, for example, Venezuela's very gradual confiscations, Cuba systematically confiscated everything all at once. Agrarian reform, urban reform, the supposed ley of abandonment, and of course we know that abandonment was not a voluntary one. It first started with excuses like la recuperación de bienes malversados of the prior regime, and then from there was vastly expanded to American companies, large Cuban companies, middle-sized Cuban companies, and down to fruit stands and shoe shine stands. In Eastern Europe, it's important to point out that in every single country, the legitimate owners have had their rights recognized. In some countries through restitution, in others through compensation, with certain conditions and restrictions. But in all those countries, that has been the basis to attract new foreign investment. In Cuba, it should be no different. The countries that have been more generous to the legitimate owners have done better economically, as they are recognized in the Heritage Foundation and Wall Street Journal Economic Freedom Index. There it was even more complicated because you had Nazi confiscations giving to ethnic Germans, and then communist confiscations from the ethnic Germans. At least in Cuba, we only have one class of claimants. We're all on the same footing. The Jewish claims, including against Switzerland and other neutral countries, give us some important precedents that we can learn from. Nicaragua, of course, was a system, a country where important laws in favor of private property were passed, but the fact that the communists did not leave the major institutions of power created significant obstacles to implementing those favorable laws. That could be the case in Cuba, unfortunately, if we don't have a clean sweep of the current regime through the upcoming transition. Obviously, I don't have much time, so I'm going to just fly through this. The U.S. Imposed the embargo in response to the confiscation, the massive confiscation of American-owned properties. Since then, many Cubans have become naturalized as American citizens. That's a second and much larger group of claimants. And then the largest group of all claimants are Cubans that are still on the island, often not talked about, but critical to the resolution of the situation in Cuba. There's an embargo, there's the Helms-Burton law, there's a tightening of the embargo against foreign traffickers, there's the Office of Foreign Asset Control administering that embargo, and there have been judgments obtained, default judgments against the Cuban government by victims of human rights abuses, not property claims in this country, and there's been an ongoing effort to collect on those debts against properties that the Cuban government has, accounts and debts that the Cuban government has across the world. Interestingly, in Spain, a very different view that coincides at the end of the day with ours here in the U.S. Spain, a fellow civil law country, there are many people in Spain that have sort of validated the efforts of myself and others, because they are also looking at saying, under the civil code, of course, confiscated owners will have remedies. And Spain, that has been expanding its citizenship to include, for example, the grandchildren of Spanish citizens because of their experiences in the Spanish Civil War, etc., might well give an advantage to descendants of Spaniards in making claims in a post-Castro Cuba. And of course, they have a lot of connection to the current regime, some of it unfavorable to us, where they're trafficking in confiscated properties. They've also experienced the lack of rule of law and the fact that the Cuban government has run up enormous debts with Spanish businessmen. And in many cases, they say, don't worry, we deposited $1 million in your bank account. El Banco Central de Cuba. Of course, you can't touch it for now until we tell you. So, there's this impunity in dealing with property guarantees and legal issues, which haunts the regime and has caused it to be second to last in the World Economic Index, ahead only of North Korea, its arms trading partner, as we've seen recently. I think I'm all out of time, and I'm sure we'll entertain some questions. You can ask some questions about the current situation and the methods or available means to protect property claims for hopefully the near future. And I think that our generation will be in the thick of this, for better or for worse. We, and when I say we, Cubans on both sides of the straits that have essentially the same virtues and vices, will have to work together to get our country back on its feet. And now I'll turn it back over to the engineers, and you can learn some real hard facts after my legal talk.
Thank you, Nick. We're sorry for the time constraint. We're going to talk now about transportation logistic, and which in Cuba is an awful situation. Transportation has been, the infrastructure, deteriorating rapidly. And in the seminar we have today the privilege of having with us Jack Rose, which I asked him to come. Oh, Jack. There you are. Jack is the Senior Marketing Program Manager at Ryder System. He holds a BS in Engineering Management from Nova Southeastern, a Master on Business Administration from Florida International, and is President of the Association of Cuban Engineers, and currently serves as a corporate advocate and board member for the Down Syndrome Association of Miami.
7 minutes, Elena? Really? 7 minutes. I guess first of all, I want to thank the Association of Cuban Engineers, la Asociación de Ingenieros Cubanos, por invitarme. I'm really Cuban. I just have an American name and an American dad, so we'll just deal with the fact that I was brought up with the guilt of going back to Cuba in a post-Castro regime, and I've lived with that guilt for the rest of my life. And I'm very proud to be here and represent the Cuban-American community. All right. So let's talk a little bit about transportation and logistics. So the analysis, let me kind of start with the performance index. What you're seeing here, this is a World Bank study in 2012 that basically ranked key indicators for customs, infrastructure, international shipment, competency, on-time delivery, and tracking. And Cuba, as of 2012, ranked 144 of 156, for the bottom 8% of the performance index across the world. That's a reflection on infrastructure. That's a reflection of a lack of control and process management. So this is kind of what you would expect to see. And the World Bank is just reinforcing the fact that the infrastructure, the logistics infrastructure in Cuba is not in a position to support the scale of almost $30 billion in capital improvement projects, which would be needed for Cuba. The next slide talks about managing scarcity. I had a lot of difficulties with this slide because it's 55, 60 years. Believe it or not, Cuba's very good at reverse logistics. They manage with scarcity. They've been doing that for the last 50 years. Irrespective of the mandates or lack of government-mandated recycling programs, they do with what they've got. There's a lack of intellectual capital, skilled labor, yet they somehow manage to maintain somewhat of a front for the travel industries in certain segments of their import and export markets, with the appearance that they've got an infrastructure in place, and as many of you know, we're talking about 50 years of no maintenance. The Panama Canal is an interesting project. The expansion is scheduled to be completed in 2014, and a lot of our freight is managed right now through the West Coast of the United States. The Port of Miami presents some opportunities to support a new basin if Cuba were in a position to manage and be in a position to be a freight forwarder or a port, if you will, for that basin. So the Port of Miami expansion project does lend itself to some opportunities both here in the United States and in Central and South America. They have a difficult infrastructure. The lack of adequately financed wholesale markets basically promotes illicit wholesale markets. So what basically happens is when you have no infrastructure in place, you have counterproductive infrastructure through illicit wholesale markets, i.e. contraband, that basically undermines the border reform process or the broader reform process. These three bullet points that I'm speaking of really make it difficult to understand how we would actually not just invest the capital, but manage the projects, provide oversight for the projects, and control spending. Next slide. Logistics needs, right? So when we talk about fleets, right, which is an area that I'm focusing on in this presentation, you have aging fleets, asset management issues. You have a fuel grid issue. You have driver training issues. You have political climate and culture. Just our aging fleets. I mean, the island is not very long, right? So when you're looking at at the La Carretera Central and you're looking at the hubs of infrastructure for fueling, for maintenance facilities, the layout is pretty straightforward as to where you would put those facilities. The challenge here is that you've got no oversight on fuel, on waste disposal management. You've got no maintenance shops for SAM class light duty vehicles, which is predominantly day cabs, which is what you need for Cuba. You don't necessarily need sleepers or long haul vehicles. So the layout for day cabs and light duty is just the nature of the geographic makeup of the island. The challenge I see here is the intellectual capital and the lack of skilled labor to support the vehicles. Next slide. I think I have this clock in my head, like, okay, I got 3 minutes, I got 2 minutes. The railways. An interesting takeaway here, depending on the railway system, 8,000 to 15,000 kilometers. The majority of it is used for sugar as opposed to passenger. The lack of capital investments, there's no signs, signals, or crossings. Portions of the rail are no longer managed, and it's safety hazards, right? So if you look at highway and you mix highway with rail, both systems require a significant overhaul to their maintenance and operations. We estimate approximately anywhere from $7 to $9 billion in just roadway improvements based on current rate of inflation with the present value of dollar. This is an interesting slide. This is a cross-border infrastructure requirement. Currently, this is the example above is what we do with the Ryder organization between U.S. and Mexico for milk processing plants. So when you look at the hubs here in Havana and some of the other areas that I've identified, we're going to need some significant infrastructure. Excuse me a second. Let me pull the slide up here because I can't see that slide. So I think the layout or the math here is basically saying we probably want to promote hubs in Havana, Santa Clara, and Santiago de Cuba. That layout supports kind of some just-in-time delivery controls for our parts. We need pooled volumes through that just-in-time delivery at those 3 ports. The recommendation would be, comprehensive cross-border services, cross-docking operations, a consolidation and deconsolidation plan, a vendor management of inventory, centralized control towers, a network viabilities and controls and reporting. So the layout is been validated in other models, and other cross-border and other cross-country logistic models. It can work in Cuba. It's just the amount of capital investment is going to be the challenge and the oversight of that capital investment. Guidelines for supply chain infrastructure. 75, and I think this is a pretty interesting and telling statistic, the majority of the spend is tied to determining the network in place and not necessarily by the team that makes up the decisions on a daily basis. Cuba has a very limited network infrastructure. Whether it's 3PL, freight forwarding, cargo, they have a very limited infrastructure with limited intellectual capital and skilled labor. My challenge is here that would significantly